Iran says it is seeking dialogue with protest leaders after a third day of unrest sparked by a record drop in the national currency's value. Demonstrations began on Sunday after shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar walked off the job. University students have joined in on the rallies. Demonstrations have now spread to several cities across the country, with residents angered by the high cost of living.
The government will listen patiently, even if there are harsh voices, because we believe that our people are patient enough, and when their voices are raised, the pressure that is being put on them is high. The government's job is to hear the voices and help them reach a common understanding to solve the problems that exist in society. We see, hear and recognise officially all the protests, the difficulties and the crises. We emphasise the right to peaceful assembly, which is also recognised in our constitution.
Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He joins us now live from Washington, D.C. Trita, thanks so much for being with us here on Al Jazeera. Let me ask you first. These protests are ostensibly about the high cost of living, but what are the other underlying issues at play here?
Well, first of all, it is very important to recognize that protests at times can start based on economic grievances, which is the case here, but quickly morph into other demands and other senses of grievances that the population has, because the situation in Iran, both politically as well as economically, has been very bad. It's not improved in any significant way. Certainly in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of social easing, but that is not sufficient to be able to address the deep problems and challenges that the society is facing. The question, of course, now is whether this will morph into something much bigger that is much broader than just the economic issues. We have seen major economic protests in Iran in the past, and many times those have ended up not being able to generate as much pressure from society because other groups may not have joined in on that. We have had situations in which the protests have been entirely political, but other parts of society have sat out those protests because their primary concerns have been economic. For this to lead to some more deeper change, it requires an ability to connect all of those different demographics.
So, Trita, you say the question right now is whether these protests will spread, whether they'll get bigger. At this point, it's been 3 days of unrest, and Iran says that it's seeking dialogue with protest leaders. What does that indicate to you? Is the government worried? And if so, how much?
I think part of it is, of course, that there is a degree of worry because Iran is also facing a very dangerous geopolitical situation with the Israelis preparing for another round of war with Iran. And we saw how Netanyahu was here in Washington just a day ago and requesting American support for starting that war. But it's also because the Pezeshkian government is trying a different tack, something that certainly has not been that the Islamic Republic doesn't have much experience in, which is actually to try to have dialogue with the population or recognize the grievances that exist and see if there's a way to meet the protesters halfway. Whether that will work or not remains to be seen, of course, but I think to a very large extent, it is the result of the fact that it is Pezeshkian who is the president right now.
So, Trita, as you mentioned, the economy has been in bad shape in Iran for quite some time now. That's nothing new. I want to ask you big picture when it comes to the economy. Where do things stand now, especially after the reimposition of Western sanctions?
Well, the Iranian economy was struggling and has been struggling for quite some time because of a combination of sanctions, mismanagement, and corruption. And sanctions become particularly effective in terms of damaging the economy when the economy is mismanaged and when there is a lot of corruption. And sanctions, in turn, also fuel further mismanagement and corruption in particular. And it's going to be very difficult for the Iranians to truly be able to address the deep structural problems that they're faced with absent sanctions relief. And right now, the trajectory is in the opposite direction. Sanctions are being imposed. Further, we have the snapback sanctions in which a lot of UN sanctions were reimposed. The Trump administration is going back to some variation of maximum pressure 2.0. And so there's not a lot of indications that the government really has an ability to turn things around. It might be able to manage some of this some of the problems in the economy, but truly being able to turn around requires sanctions relief.
With all these structural problems that you mentioned, with all these economic grievances that exist in Iran, Trita, do you expect that the government will start offering up financial reforms as a result of all this? Will this be introduced in the budget? I mean, you said that the government would like to try to manage this in a way that will calm things down. What do you expect to hear from the government in the days or weeks ahead?
I'm sure there will be various attempts at doing many of these different things. But the problem is, of course, that much of the population does not have any faith that the government actually can remedy these problems. The president himself came out about a week or so ago and said that he can't do anything about these problems. So much of the lack of faith in the government's ability to address these problems is actually because of statements by the government itself. And when you have such low expectations, even if the government were to try to, for instance, initiate a dialogue, try to meet the demands of the protests, or actually engage in some deeper structural reforms, it will take even more effort precisely because of the low expectations and the distrust and the mistrust in the capacity and competence of the government to handle this.
All right. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Great to get your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don't miss out and get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.